What this tape is going to deal with is understanding addictions and helping people to understand what goes on when a person becomes involved with the use of substances that can lead to problems in their lives. This is probably one of the most misunderstood areas in all of psychology. There have been countless theories. There's been a lot of debate over the years about exactly what addiction was, whether or not it was just something that was a sign of underlying problems such as depression. But what I want to do today is kind of present the information to you so that when you leave here, or when you're done watching this tape, that you have a greater sense about what goes on with a person who goes through the process of addiction and dependency. And hopefully so you have a better understanding about what goes on with the human mind and kind of how we work. So I want to start out with kind of a review about the way that the mind works. We have actually both a conscious and an unconscious mind. And by way of example, if you were to think of an iceberg, the conscious mind is the part that lies up here above the surface, and it really has only about 5% or less of really what's going on with us, of really the total content of our minds. The 95% actually lies down below here, down below the surface. So the types of things that are up here are the current thoughts, the different plan or solving different problems that we currently have. I have to drive from here over to the store, what I have to pick up today, what I'm doing today. Those are the things that lie in the conscious mind. Many other things lie below in the unconscious mind. But let's look at a different model to explain this too. Instead of looking at the iceberg, now let's look at the conscious and the unconscious mind in terms of two concentric circles. So that we're going to label this up here the conscious mind, and this one down here the unconscious mind. And let's talk for just a few minutes about what these different minds do. The conscious mind really only has 4 or 5 different functions. One of the functions is short-term memory. Like I said, it holds the things that we have to do today. I have to drive to the store. I have to remember to pick up a loaf of bread today when I'm on my way home. Those are the short-term memory things that we have to have in the conscious mind. Another thing that the conscious mind does is it analyzes things. I have a flat tire. What do I need to do? Well, I have to open up the trunk, take out the jack, get out the flat tire. These are the following things I have to do. It tells us the steps. Kind of a troublesome cousin to analyzing is another thing that the conscious mind does is it rationalizes. Now, when we rationalize, this can get us into a lot of trouble. Rationalizing is the part of our unconscious mind that helps us make sense out of the world. The problem is that it is very often incorrect. The rational mind looks around us and looks at what we have done and tries to present it to us in a way that makes sense so that we don't feel anxious about it. Why did I just eat the chocolate cake? Why did I become angry? Why did I have to do this as opposed to that? So that's kind of what the rational process of the unconscious mind does. It's different from the analysis because really it's kind of more self-protective, and it can be akin to justifying, excusing, rationalizing, minimizing, all the different defense mechanisms that we can get into as human beings. The other area that we have for the conscious mind is the area of willpower. The attempt by the conscious mind to bring about behavioral change. And we'll see in a few moments why that creates a lot of difficulty. There's another job of the conscious mind that we're going to talk about in a few moments, but I'll just mention it now. The other job of the conscious mind is to act as a sentry or a gatekeeper. Another term that's sometimes used for it is it acts as the critical factor. And I'll explain why in just a little bit. Now, these are basically the things that the conscious mind does. That's it. What does the unconscious mind do? Well, the primary job of the unconscious mind is actually to protect and to ensure survival. The primary job of the unconscious is to protect and to ensure survival. The unconscious mind does this actually through three primary instinctual means. There are three primary instinctual means of protection. One of the things that the unconscious mind does for protection is affiliation. It has the ability, the unconscious mind has the ability to recognize its own. For example, we see in the animal kingdom where there's an innate sense, an instinctual sense, an ability of animals to recognize other animals of their own kind. There's an ability of a mother in nature, say a mother lion, to recognize which one is her cub out of a number of other prides. There's the inane or the instinctual ability of people to be able to sense who other people are who belong to them. It's a need that we have for this connection with other people. You know how sometimes you can meet some folks and it just seems like you just kind of, quote, hit it off? Well, sometimes those people are responding to an instinctual need that we have for connection, and there's something about them that just makes us feel more comfortable with them. So the unconscious mind uses the process of affiliation, because we are basically, as human beings, we are social animals. We have a need to belong. That need to belong goes down to our basic core, to the center of who we are. Another way that the unconscious mind ensures our survival is by aggression. Whereas affiliation is the ability to recognize one's own, aggression is the tendency to protect one's own, to protect ourselves and others. Any animal put into a position of fear or into a position of danger will react with aggression. Now, it's true in about 99% of the cases. In some cases, the defense mechanisms of some organisms is such that they find other ways. The turtle, for example, can withdraw into a shell. But with most animals, they use aggression as a means of protection. And that aggression is actually below the conscious level. It happens even at an unconscious level. The third way that the unconscious tries to ensure survival or protection is by providing comfort. There's an instinctual need that we have to provide comfort for ourselves and for those who are close to us and those to whom we belong. The mother's instinctual need to provide comfort to a child. The friend's instinctual need to provide comfort to a friend. So these are the three ways that the unconscious tries to protect and ensure our survival: by affiliation, by seeking affiliation, by aggression as a defense when it feels threatened, and by comforting, the instinctual need to comfort. All of these different areas provide, they are elements actually that lead to habits, both good and bad. All of these things provide the unconscious with a sense of control. By affiliation with others, we have more control. By aggression at times when we feel threatened, we have more control. And by comforting ourselves, we feel more control. All of these things lead to something else that's in the unconscious, or that's a job of the unconscious. And that is the habits that we have. This is where the habits live. Habits both good and bad. The unconscious mind really does not recognize and think in the same way that the conscious mind does. The unconscious mind is only aware of the immediate. It is not as aware of the concept of time, of cause and effect. With the conscious mind, we can use analysis and think, well, if I do this, then this is going to follow. If I study today, then I will be able to do better in the test that I have coming up. If I work harder, then I will have these benefits come to me. If I sacrifice today, I will have this back tomorrow. The unconscious mind does not have this ability. The unconscious mind, for all of its power, really only looks at, I want to protect things now. I want to maintain stability now. And because of that, it is very immediate and very concrete. Now we're going to see in a few moments some examples of how this works and maybe make it a little bit more understandable to you, a little bit more pragmatic about how these different things interact. All of these things, the habits that lie in the unconscious, are there to try to help us to seek pleasure and to avoid pain. That's also what all these things here are for, is to seek pleasure and to avoid pain. And those are the basic drives of human beings. And those things, as I said, lie in the unconscious. The unconscious also holds all memory. Whereas the conscious mind holds the short-term memory, the unconscious holds the long-term memory. People will often look at me when I start talking about this and start kind of scratching their heads. And I'll say to them, was your favorite teacher in the 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade? Well, none. My favorite teacher was in the 2nd grade. Oh, really? What was the teacher like? Well, her name was Mrs. Busher. Well, what class was that? They start to tell you about the class, they tell you about the school, and then you start to ask them, do you remember where your desk was in the room? Do you remember the room? Yeah. They kind of look up for a second and access a memory and say, yeah. Do you remember who it was that sat beside you? Wow, Bob Stouse. I haven't thought of his name in years. Do you remember what the room was like around you? Well, yeah. Do you remember any of the posters? Yeah, I guess I do. So all of these things can be accessed automatically. Some of you who are watching this tape may have, without even really meaning to, have accessed different information back from your own school and from your own school experiences. We can access that information instantaneously. The unconscious mind has the ability to transverse time and to bring different information to us in the present. And it can even do that in ways that the information that it is bringing seems real. Have you ever daydreamed? Have you ever taken a trip back in time in your own mind while sitting in a stoplight or perhaps listening to a lecture such as this one today? Many of you may have daydreamed from the time that I started doing this talk. That's an example of the unconscious mind using some of the memories. It also has the ability to hold the reflections that we have. By reflections, I mean the analysis that we have of things that are going on. And the unconscious mind also holds all of our dreams. It is the holder, again, of our memories, dreams, and reflections, of long-term memory, of both good and bad habits, and its primary job is to protect our survival. The problem with the unconscious mind is, as I said, it does not really use reason. It only tries to protect. It has no sense of cause and effect. It only tries to protect. Let me give you an example of how this can be troublesome. One of the analogies that I often use is of a grizzly bear. A grizzly bear goes into a camp and spots a big pot of stew on a fire, walks over to the stew, starts to eat some, becomes burned, becomes enraged, and grabs the pot and hugs it, because for a bear, the primary defense mechanism is a bear hug. Well, the more that he becomes burned, the tighter that he squeezes, until finally the poor bear perishes. Why? Because he used the defense that he knew. Our unconscious is kind of the same way. It can use defenses that we know, and those defenses can cause us even greater problems. Now, we're going to see when we start talking about addictions how that occurs, because the addiction process is really something that lies in both the conscious and the unconscious mind. But actually, the addiction itself resides almost entirely in the unconscious mind. Why? Because at one time or another, the unconscious mind has learned that that drink, or that piece of food, or that act of one sort or another has brought us immediate comfort. We overlook the cause and effect relationship of it. We overlook the long-term implications because it gives me what I want now. It gives me a sense of affiliation. It gives me a sense of comfort. And even it can fulfill our need for aggression, as we will see in a few moments. So, we can train the unconscious. We have the ability to train the unconscious, but it will only react until it learns. Now, going back to the role of the sentry, or the critical factor that was out here that I mentioned earlier. The role of the sentry or critical factor is to watch information and to screen information that may come into our unconscious, and to either allow that information through into the unconscious or to deflect it and send it away. If information does make it into the unconscious, then it will be used. Then it will be successful. But the sentry works basically for the unconscious. So the sentry may say to the unconscious, I have a thought out here. And say you're a smoker, it says that you should stop smoking. The unconscious says, no, wait a minute. Do you know how much that protects me? Do you know how much I enjoy doing that? Besides that, we tried doing that before and it caused us pain and discomfort. Get rid of it. Get together with the rational side over here and basically, tell it that we'll talk to it tomorrow. Or the critical factor out here turns around to the unconscious and says, I have a thought out here that says that we should exercise. Well, the unconscious says, no, come on. We tried to do that before. Do you know how much work that I'm going to have to do? How much change we're going to have to go through to do that? Get rid of that thought. Tell it we'll exercise tomorrow. The unconscious mind doesn't like dealing with the change. It doesn't like dealing with anything that is going to cause discomfort. Now, occasionally, the willpower and our analytical mind and our rational mind can kind of gang up on the unconscious. Say that we've gained 10 pounds and we look at ourselves in the mirror and none of our clothes are fitting. And we really are getting fed up with this. So there's a short-term burst where the willpower is being activated and the analyzing part comes forward and the reason part comes forward, and all of a sudden, I'm going to diet. I'm going to change this now. Well, the unconscious at that particular moment can be somewhat overwhelmed, and it allows the process to occur. The problem is that as soon as this stress goes away in the conscious mind, as soon as these guys start doing something else, the unconscious is going to step right back in and take back what it wants. So after a couple days of this wonderful diet, you're sitting in a restaurant and they bring by the dessert tray and it has chocolate cake on the dessert tray. Well, the analytical mind says, that does look good. And the willpower says, well, I've been doing this now for about 3 days and I am getting kind of tired. It is kind of hard to keep all this up. And the unconscious says, I want that now. That gives me comfort. I want it now. So the rational side turns around and starts fighting against the conscious mind and says, you know what, I can just have this. This won't bother me. I'll tell you, I'll go back on my diet tomorrow. It's not really a problem. Or let's take the critical factor out here, says, I have an idea out here, says you should quit smoking. Well, let's say that there's been a recent medical problem. So again, the analytical mind, the rational mind, willpower, all gang up on the unconscious. And with the best effort and intention, the person says, yes, that's what I'm going to do. But the problem is that over time, there may be additional stressors. Over time, the person finds themselves wanting the cigarette more and more because that's the way that they coped. So something difficult happens to them. Say it's 3 days later and suddenly they get bad news, or they get in a fight or an argument with someone. And the unconscious mind is saying, the cigarette gave me comfort. Give it to me now. So it will team up with the rational side to basically beat up the willpower and give it what it wants. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll just smoke one. A couple days later, back up to smoking a half a pack. Because basically the other factors in the conscious mind went to sleep. So it is the unconscious mind that really dictates and runs our lives. Okay? Now, with an understanding that we have from this, let's go and talk a little bit about what is addiction. This is an area where we get into a lot more misunderstanding. The traditional model of addiction, especially with alcoholism, actually came out at sometime around the 1940s. Prior to that time, in dealing with alcohol, most people who had an alcohol problem were thought to either be depressed or suffering from some other underlying malady. And the way that they dealt with alcoholics primarily was they ended up either in jails, institutions, or dead. That was pretty much it. Something happened in the 30s that caused a radical change in the way that it was viewed. And that occurrence in the 30s has actually had probably more of a profound change on our world than any other change or occurrence in mankind's history. What happened started actually in a doctor's office in Switzerland. The doctor was Carl Jung. The man sitting in the office was a man named Roland H. Roland H. had come to see Jung because he had a problem with alcohol. Jung sent him away and told him that he was basically destined to die. Roland H. left and became very despondent, went back to the doctor's office and said, please, there must be something that I can do. The doctor looked at him and said, well, there is one way that perhaps you could save yourself. It's a combination of a spiritual, an emotional, and an intellectual process. That man, Roland H., came back to the United States and shared his ideas with a man named Ebby T. Ebby T. turned around and shared his ideas with a man named Bill Wilson, and Alcoholics Anonymous was formed. Alcoholics Anonymous presented the first time in human history where someone actually overcame the process of alcoholism and addiction. Prior to that time, it had been thought to be hopeless. Out of Bill Wilson's work, he got together with another man named Dr. Bob Smith, and the two of them went out and found an attorney, and from the three of them, it initially generated into a nucleus of 100 people and then spread out of Akron, Ohio, and across the country and now across the world. But during that time, Jack Alexander, who was a columnist for the Washington Post or the Saturday Evening Post, got a hold of this story, and he published a story in the Saturday Evening Post about these people and the fact that they were doing what they were doing, that they were actually able to overcome addiction. This struck the American Medical Society as somewhat interesting because they had up until that point not even recognized that alcoholism was a disease. So they finally were forced to come forward and to ask what's going on here. Well, when you're going to explain something to the American Medical Association, you explain it in terms of medical terms. Also at that time, the basic practice of psychology wasn't even in its infancy. There was no real field of psychology. There was some things being practiced in the field of psychiatry, but the field of psychology really wasn't even born yet. So they were looking at addiction and at alcoholism completely by the physical side. And they diagnosed alcoholism as physical or cellular addiction to alcohol. And so the term that we have today, alcoholism, actually comes from the 40s, and it's largely antiquated. It doesn't fit anymore. What really is addiction? What really is dependency? Let's talk a little bit about what some of these definitions are and then talk about understanding addictions a little bit better. First of all, let's talk about some definitions. Use, misuse, abuse, dependency, and addiction. Use of a drug. It is to take a body that is out of balance and to put it back into a state of balance. You have a headache, you go to the doctor, he gives you a pill that puts you back into a state of balance. That is the use of a drug. It is always for the purpose of health, and it follows the directions and the things that you need to do with it. Misuse of a drug. Again, it is for the purpose of restoring a body back into health from an altered state. It is always helpful. It can be problematic though. The intent is always helpful, but it can be harmful because you misuse the drug that was given. For example, you have an old Darvon laying around from a bad toothache and you have a bad headache, so you use the Darvon. You use more aspirin than you should. You use more Tylenol than you should. It's misuse of a drug. Its purpose is to restore the body back into balance, but it can be harmful. Abuse. Abuse is basically the opposite. When a person abuses a drug, they try to take the body that was in a normal state and move it to a state of imbalance. That is what abuse is. It takes it from the normal state, the natural state, and moves it to a state of imbalance. For example, a person has a feeling of tension or of difficulty. They need something to be able to unwind. They use a substance to put them into an imbalanced state. Now, some people say to me, Pat, when I use a beer, I don't really abuse it because what I am doing is I'm really using the beer to unwind and put myself back into a normal state. I say no, because the stress and tension that you feel actually is your normal state. The body is trying to tell you something, that something is wrong. The body is trying to tell you that you need to do something to correct the problem. Having a drink to fix that is kind of like going out to your car and just disconnecting the check engine soon light and calling your car fixed. But many people have this misperception that if they use alcohol or drugs to unwind, that they are in fact using it as a drug, and that's incorrect. It still is abuse. It is bringing the body from a state of balance into a state of imbalance, and it is always harmful. Dependency, and this is an area that really is misunderstood, and we'll see more in just a second. Dependency is where a person experiences difficulty as a result of the use of something, and yet that use continues. Period. That's it. Dependency is if a person experiences difficulty with a substance or with a relationship to something that they have, and that relationship continues. That in itself shows a dependency. Addiction is when the removal of a substance creates issues of withdrawal, creates withdrawal. So again, use to try to use a drug to bring the body back into norm from a state of imbalance. Misuse, the same purpose, however, the drug is misused and it can be harmful. Abuse, to take the body from a state of balance into a state of imbalance, and it is always harmful. Dependency, when a person has difficulty with the relationship and yet that relationship continues. And addiction, the removal of the relationship creates issues of withdrawal. The old way of looking at addiction and dependency and problems with alcohol was to say, here's the person over here plus the chemical or the alcohol equals the consequence. And all of the evaluations focus on the consequence. The problem with that is that the consequences can be ignored, they can be hidden, they can be enabled. In my own life, I'm about 23 years in recovery. I remember one time when I was at a party when I was younger, and I drank Mad Dog. Don't ask me why. For those of you who don't know what Mad Dog is, it's Mogen David 2020. It should be illegal. It shouldn't be anywhere on the planet. I drank a bottle of Mad Dog and then stopped on the way out of the party, and they were drinking Flaming Hookers by the door, which, for those of you who also don't know, it's when you light a shot on fire and basically down it. On the way home, 3 o'clock in the morning, I noticed I had a vitamin deficiency, so I pulled into a Mr. Donut, ate 3 chocolate donuts and a quart of chocolate milk. Went home and laid down on my roommate's brand new brocade couch, which he was very proud of. Didn't make it to the bedroom. Woke up the next day with Mad Dog and chocolate everywhere. Here was a consequence that I could not ignore, that I could not postpone, that I could not evade. This was a consequence that was right there. And my roommate was extremely upset with me. I swore then and there that I would never touch another chocolate donut again as long as I lived, because it was those damn chocolate donuts. The problem with looking at consequences with drug use, especially with alcohol, is that there are always chocolate donuts. There are always other things that we can blame it on. Well, okay, yeah, I may have gotten into a fight with my wife when I was drinking, but really it was my wife. She was being a real bitch that day. Or I may have had a problem with my boss because of my drinking, but he's just picking at me because he's always had it in for me. So looking at the relationship, or looking at our where a person is with alcohol or with drugs from looking at the consequence, can be extremely problematic. Also, we get into the I haven't done that yet. Well, you know, I haven't started where I have to drink every day yet. And that's the biggest one that I hear out of people. I don't have a problem with alcohol because I don't have to drink every day. The fact is that only about 5% of all alcoholics get to the point where they do drink every day. That takes really a group of people with a lot of intestinal fortitude. That takes real dedication to drink every day when your stomach hurts that bad, because alcohol will do that, will cause irritation, it will cause some major problems to the body. If you're doing it every day, that's a level of dedication that really only few people ever even get to. But people get, well, I haven't had that consequence yet, so I don't have a problem. The real way that we have to look at the addiction is we have to look at not the consequence, but it's right here. Because what it is the addiction is a relationship. It's a relationship of a person to a substance because they expect to get a rewarding experience. They expect to get a rewarding experience. Now, what is the rewarding experience that they expect to get? Well, the biggest thing that alcohol provides us, if we go back and we think earlier to our discussion of the conscious and the unconscious, is the alcohol provides us with a sense of affiliation. It provides us with a sense of belonging. Now, going back again and looking at that example that we used earlier about the conscious and the unconscious mind, here we are watching television, and the conscious mind and the critical factor is basically asleep because we're watching the television and just basically sitting there as like passive observers. And the idea comes in about alcohol. Mutual friends tonight is kind of special. It gives us the idea that it's going to provide us with acceptance. It gives us the idea that it's going to provide us with a sense of belonging. Remember, these are critical, instinctual needs that we have. And so the critical factor allows that thought into the unconscious. The effect of some beer commercials on people's minds, and by the way, by the time that a person is 16 years old, estimates are that they have exposure to different messages about alcohol over 50,000 times by the time that they're 16 years old. That's what statistics show, and those are conservative statistics, either through print or through television. They have that kind of exposure to the message that alcohol means good times, alcohol means friends, and it means conviviality. It means good-looking people who are all together and getting along together. Bring out your best, the Budweiser. To what extent does the commercial have an effect on human behavior, and this message have an effect on human behavior? Well, how many of you remember a Michelob commercial that said the weekend was made for Michelob? When that commercial came out, it was very, very successful. It did just exactly what it was supposed to do. Unfortunately, it wasn't good for the company they sold their Michelob on the weekends. Weekend was made for Michelob. Sales went up on the weekend. The rest of the week it stayed flat. The new campaign was the night was made for Michelob. The night is made for Michelob. They brought out that campaign. Sales went up every night of the week. That's the extent of the influence that commercials can have. But we get the idea from watching television, from exposure to other people, that alcohol gives us the need that we have to belong. It gives us a sense of belonging. So we have to look at why we have this relationship to the substance of alcohol. And the primary need is because it gives us a social connection. Now, to understand this a little bit better, I'm going to draw what's called a relationship map. And I'm going to put a person in the middle. If I ask most people who they are, usually the things that they tell me are about their family. They tell me about their job. I'm a teacher, or I'm a musician. They tell me about clubs and organizations they belong to. I'm a Rotarian or whatever. They tell me about different activities that they enjoy. They tell me about different sports teams that they may be fans of. They tell me about the school that they went to. They may tell me about their church, many people, and which church they belong to. They may tell me about different hobbies that they have, different interests, NASCAR, whatever it may be. All of these things are what people tell us when we ask them who they are. Actually, these are not who people are. These things are what people do. But the truth is that people actually become what they do. What we do becomes who we are. All of these things give us a sense of identity. They give us a sense of belonging. They meet that need that we talked about earlier to have that sense of connection. There are different hierarchies or different levels of importance among these things. For example, clubs and organizations are not as important as family, but all of the things are used by the person to provide them a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. Is it a free ride? No. For every bit of freedom that we get from these different relationships, we have to give something back. Here's an equation of life. I call it the equation of life. Freedom equals responsibility. And it is exactly equal. And it does not change. That law is immutable. For every bit of freedom that we get, we have an accompanying amount of responsibility. For every bit of responsibility that we do not keep, we lose that freedom. So along comes alcohol into this system. Now, it gives the illusion of freedom, the illusion of security, but no responsibility back. And what happens? Well, the first thing that usually happens when alcohol enters the system is it attaches itself to the activities. Maybe to the clubs and organizations or to the hobbies. And the first purpose or the first motivation, the first reason why this person has this relationship with the drug is for the purpose of pleasure. Because as I said earlier, we've been told so many times that that is what it's going to give us. And the expectation of the reward is even bigger than what actually happens. You know that when you first drank that it didn't taste good. You know that for many people it caused them a lot of discomfort and a lot of displeasure. But when people ask them, did you have a good time? Oh yeah, I can't wait to do it again. The expectation of the rewarding experience overrode the negative experience. The same thing happens with cigarettes when we were younger. Cigarettes was the same thing. Cigarettes was, most of us started smoking cigarettes around other people that we wanted to be around when we were in grade school or in school. And it provided us with a reason to be in the in crowd. It provided us with a reason to be accepted. It caused us to hack. It burned our throats. But people were patting us on the back and telling us that's the way to go. And we continued with it because of the expectation of this rewarding experience. So the first reason is pleasure. So the alcohol comes into this system and it bonds itself to the activities. The problem is that once alcohol becomes associated with the activities, it begins to dominate them. For example, I used to go out with friends. Then I go out with friends drinking. Then I go out drinking with friends. That's quite a different deal. Then I go out drinking. It used to be that my friends would kind of decide what we were going to do. It wasn't what we were doing decided to where friends were. Alcohol kind of does that, even early on. I used to go bowling. Then I go bowling and drink. Then I went drinking and bowling. I used to go fishing. Then I go fishing and drinking. Then I go drinking and fish. Then I go drinking. Alcohol, the drug, attaches itself to the substance and then comes to dominate it. Now here's a real problem. Statistics show really that it's supposedly only 10% of the people in this country have a problem with alcohol, what they call alcoholism. Okay? Now let's take a look at some other statistics. Currently, over 50% of all marriages are ending in divorce. The primary reason for the divorces, if you ask the people, is alcohol. Alcohol is identified as being the cause of divorces in 25%, or in over half of the divorces that occur. Okay, so we have roughly 55% of all marriages ending in divorce. Half of those are being identified as alcohol being the reason for the cause of the divorce. Now bear in mind that if both people were drinking, alcohol probably wasn't identified, because they're not going to identify it as something they're doing themselves. So what we're basically saying here is that 25% of all marriages in the United States end because of the effect of alcohol. Let's talk about in the hospitals. 70% of the people who are in Waterman Hospital right now are there because of at least the medical condition that they have was made worse by alcohol. Liver problems, heart problems, fights that they may have had while drinking, accidents that occurred while drinking. If you go over to the jail, 85% of the people in our prison systems are there because, in the jail systems, are there because of drugs and alcohol, alcohol being the largest. Crimes of passion, battery, all of the different aggressive acts. So 85% of the people in our prison system, 25% of all marriages, 70% of the people in our hospital system. These are the statistics on one side. The other statistic says 10% of the people in our society have a problem. Either this 10% of people are running around screwing up repeatedly and being very, very busy messing things up, or we are drastically underestimating the negative impact that alcohol is having in our society. Why? Because as a society, we have become somewhat dependent upon it. As a society, alcohol has become associated and attached to our activities to the point where when's the last time that you were able to have a party for adults and not serve alcohol and have adults stay longer than 15 minutes? The problem is when you try to look at a person's addiction or try to look and understand about addiction or alcoholism in the middle of our society as it stands, it's very, very difficult, because as a society we are very protective of it. That shows in our statistics and it shows in our attitudes. But anyway, the first reason why a dependency occurs is because the substance comes into the person's environment, it comes into their lives, and it attaches themselves to the activities, to the point where the activities no longer become enjoyable. And even at this early stage of dependency, because now they are dependent upon it to have a good time. Wives can turn to husbands and say, do you have to drink every weekend? Or can we have a holiday without you having to drink? Can't we go to dinner without you having to have the wine? Can't we have a family activity and just have you enjoy us instead of having to drink all the time? So even early on, a relationship that a person is having with alcohol is beginning to negatively affect and impact the rest of their lives. Why? Because it's providing them with an unconscious need. It gives them what they think is a need to belong and a need for comfort. And what is it actually doing? It is causing difficulty and causing damage to the other relationships. Now, as it continues, the relationship continues with alcohol, the pleasure kind of goes down because tolerance builds up. And it takes more and more to achieve the same effect. Well, you can't just keep on climbing and climbing and climbing. You can't go from a quart of beer to a 6-pack to a 12-pack to a case. People are going to start talking. What some people do is they'll combine the drug and smoke a joint, or maybe start drinking harder stuff. But eventually the pleasure kind of wears off. But there's another motivation that comes in with dependency on substances before the pleasure goes away. And that is to avoid pain. Do you remember earlier when we were talking about the primary motivations of the unconscious, seek pleasure and avoid pain? seek pleasure and avoid pain. Now we have a substance that is providing the two primary needs of the unconscious. And what does alcohol do? Well, what it does is, rather than we having to change ourselves to fit reality, alcohol is an anesthetic, a social anesthetic. What it does is it changes reality to fit us. We can go have a few drinks and suddenly the stressors that we have disappear. The problem with the boss disappears. The problem with our wives disappears. Now it may come back, but at the moment when we're having that comfort, we don't care. So the second thing that alcohol does, and that a substance does, after the pleasure motivation starts to dry up or to go away, is it now provides us with a sense of comfort, and it helps us to avoid pain. What happens to this circle? Well, we already have some of the activities, some of the clubs and organizations, and some of the hobbies and whatnot beginning to fade away because alcohol is becoming associated with them. Now, the closer relationships that we have that we used to use for coping, the family, the church, those things also become affected. We may hear things from family saying, I don't understand what's going on with you anymore. You never talk to me about what your problems are. Or when you talk about what's wrong, you don't make sense anymore. The stuff that you say just doesn't make sense. Because what a person is doing is they're using alcohol to unwind or to cope, to deal with a problem situation. And instead of thinking things through and working things out, they're basically changing their perception of reality to make everything okay. I have a fight with my wife. Do I go back and talk with her and try to resolve the issue? No, I go have some drinks and calm down. I have a fight with a boss. Go into any bar right now and you'll find some regulars who are sitting around the bar. And one of them is having a conversation about his wife or his boss causing him problems. And there's another guy sitting next to him saying, yeah, they don't understand. Basically, the alcohol and the people that they're drinking with are helping them to change reality to fit them rather than vice versa. Now, what happens over time, the alcohol does not allow us to avoid pain because the problems build up. Things continue. We continue to have more difficulty. But what happens then? Well, by the time that this one goes away, the person is now using to maintain a sense of normalcy. To maintain a sense of normalcy. They feel more normal drinking than they do without it. Why? Well, because many things in this circle have now been taken away except for the alcohol or the drug. Right now we're talking about primarily alcohol. This does apply to other substances, many other substances. The alcohol is one of the predominating factors in that person's life. And if you try to take that away, and by the way, the job usually stays because that's the part that kind of protects and provides the money. That's the one they'll really watch out for and try to protect, even above family oftentimes. But if you take the alcohol away, suddenly the person is left with a huge void. This is the thing about, there's a big difference between quitting drinking and living sober. And I have people come into my office who tell me, oh, I've quit drinking 12 times. Actually look at me with a straight face and say, I've quit drinking 12 times. I mean, some of the statements that people do make around this stage are incredible. Some people will tell me, when I can't control it anymore, then I'll stop. Now think about that statement. When I can't control it anymore, then I'll stop. And they'll sit there with a straight face. Now, to them, this makes sense. The fact is that at this point, the person is using to maintain a sense of normalcy, and when they do try to stop, they recognize that it causes them more pain to not do it than it does to do it. So they go back to drinking to stop the pain. They go back, well, I'm just going to drink a couple. Well, you know, I'll just drink on weekends. Well, I'll never drink before 6 o'clock. Well, I'll only drink wine. Well, my wife said she'd help me keep control of it. Well, what I'll do is I'll only drink beer. That's not the same as hard liquor, right? Wrong. But that's all I'll do. I'll only drink every other weekend. I won't even have to drink every week. I'll only drink when I'm on vacation. I'll only drink on special occasions. I'll only drink if I'm in a certain setting. All of these things are the strategies that people come up with to maintain the relationship to substances when they know that they shouldn't be doing it. The final And by the way, the normalcy kind of goes away. In many cases, some people are able to limp along like this for their lives and able to maintain that sense of normalcy. The other relationships that they had in their lives have become shattered, and they are becoming increasingly isolated, but they do manage to get through life at this stage. For some people, things fall apart more in their lives. But there's another motivation that comes along, and that is to seek escape, oblivion. The final motivation of a person in drinking is to seek escape and oblivion. It's no longer for pleasure, it's no longer to avoid pain, it's no longer to achieve a sense of normalcy. Now they may know that they have a problem, but they don't care. The major thing that they want to do is just for all the problems to go away. People who know that they have an alcohol problem and yet they continue. People who make jokes about being alcoholic. People who are chronic relapsers. The problem with this is the unconscious mind has a desire to protect. And that drive to protect can become so strong that the unconscious mind will go to any length to provide it, even up to suicide. Now, this is somewhat of a bizarre statement, but if you really talk to someone who's contemplated suicide, they did not want to die. The person who commits suicide does not want to die. They want to stop the pain. Suicide, in fact, in some twisted way, becomes their last available survival mechanism. What they really want to do is to escape pain. They don't necessarily want to die. A person with a gun in his mouth is not thinking about the bullet. He's thinking about getting away from the pain. The same thing is true about people who relapse with alcohol. They're not necessarily thinking about the drink. They're thinking about stopping the discomfort that they feel without it. And that need to escape is the final motivation that people have. So it can take them from the pleasure to avoiding pain to maintaining normalcy to escape. Now, an interesting part also, once they're at this stage, many people say, I don't drink as much as I used to. Well, no, because when we're here, we're trying to maintain the relationship. We're trying to control it. So during that time, yes, the drinking is going to go down to a certain extent, but what you need to look at is what's happening with a person's relationships in their lives. What's happening in the other part of their lives. And by the way, all of this can occur. The obliteration of their social system and of their families and of their lives can occur before we've even come to what other people would call, or what some people would define as addiction. Because these people may not drink every day. These people may not have to have it. And yet, it's wreaked devastation in their lives, and they still don't recognize that fact. Well, let's review a little bit. Look at this another way, and another way it progresses. It goes from a person makes a personal commitment to drink. I make a personal commitment to be here today to talk to you. Doesn't necessarily mean you and I have a relationship, just means I made the personal commitment to be here. If you and I become friends, that is a committed personal relationship. You become a part of my life, I become part of yours. That's the difference between a personal commitment, one-time shot, commit a personal relationship, we develop a relationship. When you have a committed personal relationship, you begin to develop certain psychological dependencies. I depend upon you to provide me certain things, you depend upon me. One kind of interesting aside is that the way that a handshake came about. People sometimes like to talk about ritual. I love different rituals that we get into. Kind of also gives an example of the unconscious need that we have to belong as opposed to fight and whatnot. The way that a handshake came about was people would approach each other on the battlefield and they would hold up their sword hands and they would show that they were unarmed. That's how they would approach each other. What a handshake meant was I replace my dependence upon aggression or upon defense with our affiliation, and we now protect each other, so we no longer need our swords. So when they combined hands, they were basically protecting each other with each other rather than with swords. So that's kind of where that came from. It's kind of just an interesting point. But we develop a psychological dependency on those relationships that we develop. When we have a psychological dependency, we start to develop, with alcohol, a mental obsession because the unconscious, in sensing stress or in sensing discomfort, comes up with the alcohol as being the thing that helped us with pain. Now, you talk to an alcoholic and family members may look at them and say, I don't know why he's drinking. Or a person is dependent on alcohol. I don't know why he's drinking. It's causing him all these difficulties. And the conscious mind of the person who drinks will even say that. Yeah, you're right. It causes me difficulty. But if you really get to where they live, if you really understand them, there's a part of them that's saying, you know what? Alcohol is the one thing that helps me deal with all those problems. It doesn't really cause me the problems. It's the one thing that helps me cope with those problems. And people don't understand that. That's the depth of the relationship that they have to it. So when a person goes into stress, the deal of mental obsession. Now, those of you who don't understand this, those of you who may not have a problem with alcohol, if you've ever tried to quit smoking and a stressor came along, the unconscious mind takes the stress, boom, that's the thing that's going to help it. Reach for the cigarette. That is the mental obsession. The mental obsession becomes an emotional compulsion. The emotional compulsion is where now the emotions are dictating the rational mind and basically even the willpower to move toward what it is that's going to solve the pain, that's going to take away the pain. So the emotional compulsion comes in quitting smoking cigarettes. I know I shouldn't. Emotional thought comes in, leads me to reach for the cigarette even though my mind is screaming no. I am emotionally compelled to do it. I smoke it. What happens? I feel terrible about it. The alcoholic knows he shouldn't do it, reaches for the bottle, halfway drunk, feels terrible about it. The person who knows they shouldn't smoke pot reaches for the bag, rolls it up halfway through the joint. Why did I do this? It's an emotional compulsion. It's a mental obsession that comes with emotional compulsion, and as a result of that, what happens is a low self-image. Because we're basically doing something that we didn't want to do. We cannot change our behavior to fit our values, so we begin to change our values to fit our behavior, and that brings about low self-image. When we have low self-image with ourselves, it affects our relationship with other people, so we develop rigid negative attitudes toward other people because we don't feel good about ourselves, and we externalize that. We put that on other people because we can't stand to keep that on ourselves. Rigid negative attitudes. Rigid negative attitudes held over time become rigid negative beliefs. Our beliefs are those things that we have held in our minds for over a period of time. Rigid negative attitudes become rigid negative beliefs. Once we have rigid negative beliefs, that's where the symptoms of delusion and denial come in. And once the symptoms of delusion and denial come in, the person's flying blind. I have a person who's scheduled to come in my office sometime this week who's losing his wife. He knows that he was smoking pot too much, didn't really want to talk about the cocaine, didn't really want to talk about some of the other drugs, was of the point where he had convinced himself that as long as other people did not know what he was doing and he was able to hide it from them, he did not have to face it. And in his own mind, that meant he was able to have two separate realities. The way that he saw things and the way that other people saw things, and he chose to call the way that he saw things reality. In his mind, as long as he didn't get caught, he was able to get away with it and he was able to do what he wanted to do. He has the committed personal relationship to the substance. He has the psychological dependency. He often has the mental obsession when he tries to stop. The mental obsession leads him to the emotional compulsion. The resulting feelings, the resulting dynamics cause a low self-image. The low self-image brings the rigid negative attitudes toward others, becomes angry. The anger goes outwards. Over a period of time, that becomes a rigid negative beliefs, and now he's to the point where he doesn't even see where he's at. He's not able to even contemplate, to comprehend where he's really at. Now, the interesting thing is, take away the drinking, the alcohol, and basically, you've still got all the rest of these symptoms. for recovery. So, the process of addictions is a relationship of a person to a mood-altering substance and expectation of rewarding experience. I hope that the talk today has had some value to you. I wanted to talk about how a person goes through the process of getting into the dependency. Another talk that we're going to be doing a little later can talk about some of the issues of recovery, but this one is for you to understand a little bit more about the process of addictions. If you have any questions, I'm sure that we'll be meeting after you view this, and I'll be happy to discuss those things with you then. Thank you.